Hello. After a brutal breakup, I escaped to a quiet seaside town. Just me, the ocean, and silence. I didn't expect to meet Micah. I didn't expect to feel anything. But day after day, he was there, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more I realized he wasn't just watching me. He saw me, and that changed everything. The sea had always been Adrian Locke's quiet witness. Long before heartbreak and exhaustion became permanent shadows beneath his eyes, the ocean had watched him grow, stretch, retreat. Now, at 35, with a career in architecture hanging on autopilot and a life in fragments, he found himself again at its edge, this time in a forgotten coastal town whose name he hadn't even known a week ago. The house he rented stood slightly crooked, as if leaning toward the water it could never quite reach. Wooden shingles, weathered and grayed by years of salt and wind, covered its frame like worn armor. Adrian liked it for that very reason. It didn't pretend. It didn't apologize for the storm. Each morning began with silence and ended the same way. The routine was simple. Coffee at dawn, long walks along the beach when the tide was low, evenings on the porch with a blanket and notebook he never opened. He wasn't here to work. He wasn't here to heal. He didn't even know what he was here for. But the ache inside him needed stillness, and the ocean provided just that. He noticed Micah Reed on the third day. It wasn't a dramatic introduction. No crashing waves or flying paint. Just a figure, seated cross-legged on the sand, near the dunes, sketchbook in lap, shoulders angled toward the horizon. He had a mess of sun-bleached hair, tied loosely at the nape, and wore an oversized linen shirt stained in earth tones. He didn't seem to notice Adrian watching. Or, if he did, he made no indication. There was something unguarded about the way Micah moved, even when still. Like he had no interest in hiding from the world, even as he kept his distance from it. It was a sharp contrast to Adrian, who wore solitude like a second skin. The first day he saw him, Adrian passed by slowly, pretending to examine the driftwood scattered across the beach. The second day, he paused a little longer, pretending to adjust his scarf against the wind. By the fourth, there was no pretending. Micah was there every morning, like part of the landscape, constant, quiet, unknowable. They didn't speak, and yet something shifted. It began with a nod. Micah looked up briefly one morning, his pencil resting against the page, and offered the smallest lift of his chin. Adrian returned it without thinking, the motion so natural it startled him. He found himself walking at different times, adjusting his route to pass closer to where Micah sat. Still, there were no words, just glances and silence, and the sound of the waves unraveling everything unspoken between them. Adrian tried to write about it. Each night, he sat with the same notebook on his lap, the same pen poised above the same blank page. Nothing came. How could he explain something that didn't exist in conversation or action, but only in the way the air felt when Micah was near? The town was small enough that he began to recognize its rhythms. The creak of the fish market cart in the mornings. The same 3 dogs barking at seagulls. The wind lifting leaves outside the cafe. He caught sight of Micah there one day, too, seated alone by the window, hunched over a book that looked borrowed and well-worn. Adrian didn't enter. He wasn't ready for the possibility of words. One night, during low tide, he walked farther than usual. The beach stretched endlessly, bare and reflective under the moonlight. He stopped by a piece of driftwood shaped like a crooked spine and sat, letting the cold seep into his legs. His hands, clasped between his knees, trembled slightly, not from the chill, but from the restlessness inside him. There was something terrifying about being still for too long. Silence gave space to memories. It wasn't just the end of his relationship that haunted him. It was the years he spent building someone else's version of a future, only to realize it didn't fit. His life had become a structure with no foundation. Beautiful to look at, easy to admire from a distance, but empty at its core. He didn't hear Micah approach, but he felt it, the faint shift in atmosphere, the added presence in the night. Adrian didn't turn. He didn't need to. The silence between them had become a kind of language. Micah didn't sit. He simply stood nearby, eyes likely trained on the same waves Adrian had been watching. Minutes passed like hours, and when Micah eventually turned and walked away, Adrian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That night, the notebook wasn't empty. He didn't write a story, just a few words. He doesn't speak, but I think he sees me, and it was enough. For now, days began to flow into one another, each nearly indistinguishable from the last. Adrian found comfort in the repetition. The ocean never changed, not really, and the weather followed a predictable rhythm. Morning mist, midday sun, and cool twilight that rolled in with the tide. In a way, it was like the world had decided to breathe a little slower in this corner of the coast. Micah was still there. Every morning, like a fixture of the shoreline, he appeared with his sketchbook. Sometimes he sat closer to the dunes, sometimes down by the rocks. He rarely stayed in the same spot 2 days in a row, yet Adrian could always find him without trying too hard. It had become part of his own routine, coffee in hand, notebook in bag, slow walk across the beach with eyes scanning the horizon until he spotted the quiet silhouette. There was a kind of gravity to it all. They didn't speak, never had, but their paths crossed now like threads pulled taut by unseen hands. They had developed a rhythm, a glance, a pause, a silent nod. Nothing more, but never less. It was enough to keep Adrian grounded, even as he felt the pieces of himself shift in unfamiliar ways. At night, Adrian began to write again. Not stories, not architectural drafts or plans, just thoughts, fragmented, raw, often tangled and unfinished. He filled page after page with descriptions of the tide, the shape of the wind against the windows, the strange comfort of shared silence. Micah became a recurring theme, though never by name. Only references, the figure near the shore, the one who sees, the boy with salt-stained wrists. Adrian didn't know why it mattered. Micah was just a stranger, a man who happened to inhabit the same quiet stretch of earth. And yet, there was something in the way Micah moved, graceful without effort, unafraid to take up space, that stirred something Adrian had long since buried. He had spent most of his adult life in measure control. Every word, every gesture calculated, every relationship tidy and structured like one of his designs. His ex-partner had once accused him of being emotionally sterile, too afraid to feel things deeply. At the time, Adrian had dismissed it. But now, watching Micah brush graphite across a page with the sun casting shadows across his face, he wondered if it had been true. There was nothing structured about Micah. His art, his clothes, even his posture, all of it felt like it belonged to someone who had chosen to live uncontained. One afternoon, the weather changed. Rain arrived early, pushing inland with sudden force. Adrian had just reached the beach when the first drops began to fall, slicing through the air like needles. He turned to leave, already wet, when he caught sight of Micah. The younger man was crouched beneath an overhang of driftwood and rock, his sketchbook clutched tightly to his chest. Adrian paused. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the rain. Micah didn't gesture or move, but something in the tilt of his head suggested acknowledgement. Adrian didn't approach. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned away. By the time he reached his cottage, his clothes were soaked through, and his hands trembled from more than just the cold. That night, he couldn't write. Instead, he paced. The rooms felt too small, the air too heavy. He stared at the pages of his notebook without seeing them, hearing only the whisper of rain against the windows and the echo of that silent gaze. The next morning, the sky cleared. The beach shimmered with puddles and scattered shells. Micah was there again, this time perched on a large stone, sleeves rolled to his elbows, eyes fixed on the distance. Adrian approached slowly, stopping at the usual distance between them. He didn't expect anything different. But this time, Micah reached into his bag and pulled something out, a piece of folded paper. Without rising, he placed it on the sand beside him, weighed down with a smooth, flat stone. Then he stood, slung his sketchbook over one shoulder, and walked away without a word. Adrian didn't move at first. He stared at the stone, at the page beneath it, unsure whether to approach. But the tide was coming in. He stepped forward and picked it up with careful fingers. It was a sketch of him, seated on driftwood, face turned away, shoulders curved slightly inward, the ocean behind him a blur of charcoal and soft lines. It wasn't dramatic or detailed, but it carried something undeniable: recognition. Not just of his figure, but of the quiet grief in his posture, the fatigue he carried. Adrian held the paper in both hands, the wind lifting its corners. For a long time, he stood there, unsure of what to feel. Then, quietly, he folded the sketch and placed it into his notebook. The silence between them remained. But now, it carried something new. Not tension, not uncertainty, but the fragile beginning of understanding. And Adrian realized, maybe this wasn't about healing. Maybe it wasn't even about starting over. Maybe it was just about being seen and letting someone see back. The sketch changed something, not in a dramatic, cinematic way. No lightning bolt, no pounding epiphany. But something inside Adrian shifted quietly, like a window opening just enough to let in a breeze. It was the first time in a long while he had seen himself through someone else's eyes, and not as a figure of control or accomplishment, but as someone human, worn, uncertain, still searching. He kept the sketch in his notebook, folded neatly between the pages filled with half-thoughts and fragmented sentences. Some nights, he would open it and simply stare. It wasn't vanity that drew him in. It was the honesty. The way Micah had captured his posture, the soft tilt of the shoulders, the curve of the spine, like a man carrying weight he no longer had words for. It felt like being understood without needing to explain. Adrian didn't thank him. He couldn't. Not yet. But he stopped avoiding Micah's eyes when they passed each other on the beach. He stood a little closer, let the silences stretch longer. And in return, Micah offered small, wordless gestures, an extra nod, a glance held for a moment longer than before, the quiet suggestion of presence without pressure. One evening, Adrian sat on the porch, sketchbook in his lap. Not to draw, but to think. The sea murmured in the distance, low and steady. A storm was gathering somewhere far off, and the sky had turned a dull bronze, as if the horizon had rusted. He thought of the sketch again, not just the image, but the care it implied. The stillness required to observe someone that closely. He wondered how long Micah had been watching him before he'd even noticed. The next morning, Adrian arrived at the beach early. The air was cool, the tide low. He walked slower than usual, glancing toward the dunes where Micah often sat. But the younger man wasn't there. The beach was empty, save for a few gulls picking through seaweed. Adrian continued walking, but something felt off, like a note missing from a familiar song. He spent the entire morning by the water, seated on driftwood, eyes scanning the distance. When he returned to his cottage, he was unsettled in a way he couldn't name. Micah didn't return the next day either, or the day after that. Adrian tried not to think about it, but his routine faltered. He still walked, still wrote, still brewed coffee at the same time each morning, but the beach felt hollow, as if the tide had pulled something away that wasn't just sand. On the fourth day, a note appeared. Not handwritten, not folded, not left deliberately. It was printed on the back of a gallery flyer, half crumpled, wedged beneath a smooth stone outside Adrian's door. No name, no explanation, just a few lines. I wasn't sure you'd want more, but if you ever do, I'm at the workshop behind the cafe. Third door. There was no signature, none needed. Adrian held the note for a long time before setting it down beside the kettle. He didn't move for a while, just sat there, listening to the wind outside, the occasional cry of a bird, the distant hush of the surf. Later that afternoon, he walked into town. The cafe was quiet, tucked between a second-hand bookstore and a surf shop. Its windows were steamed, and the faint scent of roasted beans and lavender drifted through the air. Adrian didn't enter. Instead, he slipped down the narrow alley behind the building, where a row of wooden sheds and garages formed a crooked line against the back wall. The third door was painted a faded green. Unlocked. Inside, it smelled of paper and charcoal, wood and turpentine. Sketches lined the walls, some framed, others pinned casually to corkboards. Subjects varied: locals, landscapes, fragments of the beach. But Adrian noticed one thing they all shared: detail. Each drawing pulsed with attention. as if the artist had poured hours into seeing every line, every curve, every shadow. And then he saw it, a new sketch, unfinished, resting on an easel in the center of the room. It was him again, this time not seated, but standing near the edge of the tide. His face wasn't visible. He was turned away, but the posture, the stillness, the quiet tension in the hands were unmistakable. And something else, too. In the background, near the water's edge, was a second figure. Looser in form, softer, yet clearly present. Adrian stood in silence, heart steady but loud. He wasn't sure what he felt, flattered, exposed, moved. All of it, maybe. Behind him, footsteps. Micah entered without speaking. He moved casually, but his eyes held that same strange mix of caution and confidence. He didn't seem surprised to find Adrian there. He didn't ask why he came. He didn't say anything. But in the quiet of the studio, surrounded by sketches that said everything neither of them could voice, something softened between them. Not a confession. Not yet. But the beginning of one. And for Adrian, that was enough. Adrian began to return to the workshop. Not every day, not on a schedule, but often enough that silence no longer felt like a barrier. There were still no real conversations between him and Micah. Just shared space, measured calm, never pressing. Sometimes Adrian would stand quietly behind him, watching lines form on paper. Other times, Micah would leave out an extra stool, a gesture both casual and intentional. They didn't need words. Not yet. The walls around Adrian had always been high, layered over years of practiced self-preservation. He was the kind of man who organized emotion into tidy compartments, who used design to make sense of chaos. But something about Micah, his soft presence, his unfiltered creativity, made it difficult to keep those walls intact. Micah's workshop was a sanctuary of chaos. Charcoal dust-coated most surfaces, canvases leaned in loose towers against the walls, and finished sketches hung from strings like drying laundry. It was cluttered, but never careless. Every object had been touched by intention, by time, by something felt more than calculated. Adrian, who had spent most of his adult life working in glass and steel, now found comfort in rough edges and uneven frames. He would trace the curves of pencil lines with his eyes, finding rhythm in Micah's imperfect strokes. Each one felt honest, brave, something Adrian had forgotten how to be. One day, while the wind howled beyond the workshop walls, Adrian found himself sketching again. Not buildings, not blueprints, just lines, forms without function, shadows without dimension. His hand trembled at first, the pencil foreign in his grip. But he didn't stop. Micah didn't watch. He simply let Adrian be. That, more than anything, made space for something real to grow. The sketch wasn't good. It was clumsy and half-formed, but it felt right. For the first time in months, Adrian wasn't performing. He wasn't building something to be admired or sold. He was simply expressing something he couldn't put into words. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, listening to the ocean grind against the shore, thinking about the distance between where he was and where he'd once imagined himself. His past relationship had been safe, respectful, built on shared plans, long-term goals, and quiet compromises. But it had lacked this raw awareness, this unpredictable pull. It scared him. Micah wasn't safe, not in the traditional sense. He didn't come with labels or guarantees. He was messy, young, unafraid to be still in the moment. And yet, Adrian had never felt more seen. The next morning brought high tide and gray skies. The air was heavy with salt, and the waves pressed hard against the sand. Adrian walked the beach slowly, letting the wind whip around him. He passed the driftwood where he had once sat alone, past the place where Micah had first left the sketch. By the time he reached the dunes, his hair was damp, his scarf clinging to his neck. And there was Micah, standing barefoot in the wet sand, trousers rolled to his calves, his sketchbook nowhere in sight. He looked out at the water, unmoving, his arms crossed against the wind. Adrian stopped a few feet behind him. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Time slowed. The waves grew louder. The cold bit at his skin, but he remained still, watching. Micah turned slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. There was no smile. No, just something raw in his expression, acknowledgement, maybe, or quiet challenge. Adrian stepped forward. The distance closed by inches. He didn't touch him. He didn't speak. He simply stood beside Micah, shoulder to shoulder, both of them facing the endless gray. And for a while they stayed like that. Two men, two stories, standing at the edge of something neither could name. Adrian felt the walls inside him shift. Not fall, but tremble. He wasn't ready to say what he felt. He wasn't even sure he understood it yet. But for the first time, he wanted to. He wanted to try. And that, for now, was enough. The tide pulled back slowly, leaving behind long ribbons of wet sand and shallow pools that mirrored the overcast sky. It was one of those mornings when the air felt suspended, heavy with unsaid things, and the world seemed to hold its breath between moments. Adrian stood by the water's edge, shoes in hand, the cold biting softly at his bare feet. He watched the way the ocean retreated, inch by inch, revealing fragments of shell, smooth stones, and quiet possibilities. Everything about the landscape felt temporary, transient in a way that matched the uncertainty inside him. He hadn't planned to return to this exact spot, but when he woke that morning, something in him knew he needed to. Not to escape, not to understand, but to be present. Fully. No sketches, no notebooks. Just him, and whatever this had become. Micah arrived without sound. Adrian felt him before he saw him, like a shift in the tide, a quiet adjustment of balance. When he turned, Micah was standing several feet away, eyes scanning the horizon, hands tucked in the pockets of his weathered coat. His posture was relaxed, but not distant. There was no hesitation in his presence. They didn't speak. Instead, Adrian walked toward a piece of driftwood and sat, gesturing faintly for Micah to join him. The younger man moved without a word, settling beside him with the ease of someone who understood silence not as absence, but as connection. For a long while, they simply watched the sea breathe. Adrian's hands rested on his knees, fingers occasionally curling into the fabric of his jeans, as if anchoring himself to the moment. He could feel his pulse, slow but insistent, as if his body were reminding him, "You're still here. You're still alive. You're allowed to feel this." He wanted to say something, anything, but language felt too fragile, too imprecise. Every word he considered sounded like a compromise, or worse, a misrepresentation of what had grown between them. It wasn't love. Not yet. Perhaps not ever in the conventional sense. It was recognition. The kind that goes deeper than affection or desire. The kind that comes when two people carry similar bruises in different places. When silence between them isn't awkward, but sacred. When one presence softens the weight of simply existing. Micah leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and let out a slow breath. The sound was small, but real. Adrian glanced at him, at the way his jaw tensed and released, the way his eyes stayed fixed on the waves. He looked older in that moment, not in age, but in truth. Still, they didn't speak. Not until the tide began to return. Adrian finally broke the stillness with a whisper, not much more than air. "I don't know what this is," he said, eyes low, voice steady. "But I don't want to pretend it's nothing." Micah didn't answer right away. He let the words settle, then nodded, slow, measured. Not as agreement, but as acknowledgement. That was all Adrian needed. They sat a while longer, until the wind picked up and the ocean grew bolder. When they finally rose, their shoulders brushed, neither of them stepping away. There was a quiet understanding that nothing had been resolved and nothing needed to be. On the walk back, their strides matched naturally. Adrian didn't speak again. Micah didn't try to fill the space. They passed the dunes, the rocks, the fading marks their shoes had left in the sand. The world resumed its motion around them, but they moved within it gently, like two parts of the same current. At the edge of town, where the path forked toward their separate spaces, they paused. Micah reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded square of paper. He handed it to Adrian with a calm expression and no explanation. Adrian took it without opening it, trusting the weight of the gesture. Then, without drama or goodbye, Micah turned and walked toward the cafe. Adrian watched him go, not with longing or regret, but with a sense of quiet possibility. Back in the cottage, Adrian unfolded the paper. It wasn't a sketch. It was a note, handwritten, uneven lines that trailed slightly at the edges. Some people teach you how to breathe again. You didn't ask for it. Neither did I. But here we are. Adrian read it twice, then once more. He placed it inside his notebook, right next to the first drawing, the one where he sat alone, unaware he was being seen. The house felt different now. Not fuller, not warmer, but softer. Outside, the tide continued its quiet rhythm. And inside, Adrian finally allowed himself to exhale. Goodbye.